Dr. Harriet Fraad has been a practicing psychotherapist for decades. Before that, she was a founder of second wave feminism in the late 1960s. And in recent years, she's gained a popular following through her podcast, Capitalism Hits Home, produced by Democracy at Work, which argues for democratic workplaces. She has provocatively critiqued the exposed crimes of figures like Harvey Weinstein, Roger Ailes, and others as being enabled both by sexism in the broader society and by capitalist structures that give such figures unelected, coercive power over the livelihoods and prospects of those who have become their victims. She has argued that there are systemic solutions and alternatives that are better for our economic, social, and mental well-being. We're lucky to have such a wide-ranging thinker and practitioner in our midst. Dr. Harriet Fraad, thank you so much for being here today.
Well, I'm really glad to be here. You've sent me questions which are super exciting.
I'm looking forward to diving in. Let's begin by going back in time a little bit. Before you go to college, you end up having these three main streams, I would say, that run through your entire career of feminism, class critique, and also, of course, psychotherapy. As we go back to before you go to college in the 1960s, what does the world around you look like, and how are your interests developing and responding to that world?
Well, it was a world of possibility. All the other superpowers or powers were decimated by World War II. We were the only standing economy. And so we were very prosperous, and there was loads of money around. I was class conscious because my father was class conscious. And my father, who was sort of a cameo appearance fellow in my life, was during the 30s a communist, and then left out of boredom more than out of ideological upset. But he gave us books, me and my older sister, about heroic figures. Marzani and Mansell had a left publishing house. And when he talked to us, like he talked to us about people who were going to jail in the McCarthy era, and we thought, oh, they must be bad if they're going to jail, because we were good little American kids. Right. And my dad said, no, they are our red badge of courage. They had the courage to stand up for what they wanted and what they believed in a fair world. And that's why they're going to prison, which was really important. And I did have that sense of justice. I even joined this group just to rebel called the Zealots. And it was run by a guy named Mark Schleifer, who then became Arabic, changed his name, and worked on Al Jazeera. But it was called the Zealots. And we picketed Jewish temples with signs like Abe Leibowitz owns 6 units in Harlem. Picture the rats and roaches from which he is profiting. Cast that moneylender out of your temple, and things like that, which was a lot of fun for us. But, and I joined it because I did believe that you can't pretend to be holy while you're exploiting people terribly and leaving them in misery. But it was also a chance to rebel. I knew already by 6th grade that I did not want to live in my nuclear family, and that it was a lie on a lot of levels. And I even tried when I was in 3rd grade. I saw the book by Engels, The Family, Private Property, and the State. And I thought, whoa, that has something in it for me. But I really couldn't understand it at that point, 4th grade, you're not quite ready. But I knew that there was something. And I wanted to go to boarding school and live with other kids. It was only later that I realized that the whole bizarre assumption that because you're knocked up, you could take care of anybody is indeed a bizarre question. It's a bizarre idea. And then after reading Jacques Donzelot's marvelous, although difficult to read book, Policing the Family, I realized that, oh yes, it was deliberately created after feudalism to let every man be the feudal lord of his own wife and kids, and every wife have protection in pregnancy and the chance to be chattel for children. So it made sense to me. But I couldn't really formulate it in my mind. I just knew I wanted to get out of that nuclear family and live with other kids. But, in the around that time, the civil rights movement was starting, and I really believed in that and went to, picket lines and Woolworths because I knew about justice, and I also had a sense of identity with the outsider. For several years, I was shipped off to different relatives, me and my sister, between the ages of 2 and 4, because my father, never having a very close relationship with my mother, signed up to go overseas instead of be a doctor examining recruits. And he didn't mention that to her till after he signed up. And my mother, who wasn't keen on us in the first place, had a breakdown, a very common form of breakdown of bourgeois women whose husbands were away. They got a psychogenic form of tuberculosis. And the cure of tuberculosis then was you leave your family and you go to a resort where you rest. So that was convenient for her. And I lived with several different families with different religions. And I kind of learned that they all had absolute rules and they were all full of crap. And that, you had to be what they wanted. I learned psychotherapy because I really learned to watch these people and learn what they needed and try to be that so that my tenure at these places would be longer. Now, my sister was very hostile. She, broke shit and put fish hooks in the sofa and stuff. So we got kicked out of several of them. But I learned to watch people. I remember one of my aunts was Catholic, my aunt and uncles, and, because of her, a truck driver returned me to the house once because I was lying on the road as a tiny little girl. And he said, "What are you doing there?" And I said, I'm waiting to get run over. I want to live with Jesus. That looks much better. The logic is there. And because of that, my aunt sort of thought I was a holy child because she was very superstitious. And when she went to hit me, I said, "Though you hit me and tear me limb from limb, Aunt Mary, I will always love you." So she thought I was a little saint, and I got, very good treatment. So I learned how to psych people out of necessity. I learned to identify with outsiders. And I learned that everybody's family is absolute and full of crap, and they're all different. And those were invaluable lessons, really important in my early life. And I think I was interested in psychotherapy because psyching out people was very important to me for my survival, both at home and at these other places. And politics, I learned both from being an outsider in formative years and also having a father who shared very little, but shared his views on that with me. And he was a leftist and a committed leftist. And so that's where I kind of got my politics, my interest in psychotherapy. And I got my interest in feminism from watching my mother, who was a very capable woman who was trained as a lawyer and then as an art historian, and only worked for 2 years in my whole life, and was enraged at her children because she didn't want to be stuck at home taking care of us, but was also too frightened to defy the stereotypes that women are terrible if they work outside the home. And so she didn't let herself do that. And I loved her and felt sorry for her, even though she was really mean. I loved her and felt very sad for her, even when she would sometimes hit me. I could see the desperation in her much more than I could think about my own hurt. I could think I touched the hot coil of her own insecurity, and that's why. So those were, the 3 feeder streams that you very intelligently found.
It's It's a lot of, that's a lot of stimulus at a very, very young age, and
Yes,
a lot of very personal fodder. And I can see how, from the description that you've given, you seem to see those things as always being interconnected, always having relationships to each other.
yes, I do. I certainly do. And I watch what's going on in America, that 44% of the population are low-wage workers, which means $7.25 an hour, which means that two full-time minimum wage workers can't afford a two-bedroom apartment in any state, city, or county in the whole United States. And I see that they're being oppressed and taught to blame themselves psychologically, that somehow they are losers. And I feel the tragedy of that. And the tragedy of what happened to this country, which was very hopeful. When I was younger, and me and my cousins grew up in a land of hope and opportunity. You know, we won World War II. It was the last war the US won in spite of our bloated military, but we also won a war for justice. And the UN was started, and we sang songs in public PS9 praising the UN, you know, nations small and great, you know, we'll rid the world of hate as long as we keep working like a team, you know, that's the kind of stuff we sang. And so there was a level of hope that ran a thread throughout the society. So one that wasn't as dependent upon one's nuclear family, but was in a culture of hope, which helped a great deal. And also helped me become an activist and believe in people uniting for change, even as a kid.
It's fascinating. I'm deviating a little from my pre-planned questions, but Noam Chomsky talks about, he has a documentary called Requiem for the American Dream. And he says, you know, even in the Great Depression, there was this assumption that things would get better, people would figure things out. And is it a surprise to you to see the degree to which that has, in many cases, faded, or especially around 2008 and the years after 2008, there was not this assumption that things would continue to improve?
No, I think the majority of people voted for Obama. They didn't think he was the same old stuff colored in brown. They thought he was hope and opportunity. Who would have imagined he would have crushed all occupies on the same day with a federal effort?
Right.
But instead of getting hope and change, people got debt and despair. And I think it drove some people to a fascistic right wing. And I think it drove others to hoping and leftist activity and union activity, which we're seeing now. I also think the failure, those people who thought it was all their fault, have faced the failure of our market-driven healthcare system, so that we have the most deaths per capita in the whole world. I mean, whoa. And depression to boot, so that we see ourselves, instead of being triumphant as a falling empire, where we have got to make a claim for most of us or we'll be destroyed. It's a very different sense than I got as a kid.
Something that maybe fits into the context of this a little bit, it's kind of the in-between piece. You chronicle in depth how in the second half of the 20th century, there was social progress in the sense of women no longer being economically dependent upon men. But at the same time, we saw the disappearance of the family wage, the ability to support a household. We saw the disappearance of a lot of secure jobs. We saw a lot more worker precarity and the growth of household debt, credit cards, and student loans and these things. Can you talk about this difficulty of trying to have social progress under the neoliberal conditions that we've been pushing through?
I think it's been impossible, because I think that what happened was a real mean trick. I mean, the big capitalists in the United States were enabled by easy jet travel, easy means of communication with faxes, with computers, and currency transfers that were easy, to export union, well-paid American jobs to places that had no ecological protections, that had salaries of $1 to $3.50 an hour. China gets the best wages now, and I think their average is $3.50 an hour. Which, of course, in China that can buy more, but nonetheless, it's hardly the great living. And so they transferred their wealth to Asia, to Bangladesh, to India, to China, to Pakistan, where conditions are terrible and people work for $1 to $3.50 a day, and then imported their money back here and bought our for sale system. And so that Americans felt disempowered, and they saw that we're getting the best democracy money can buy, and that may not be so great for the mass. And so they kind of gave up for a while, watched TV, ate crappy food, got fat, and gave up hope. And that all has only begun to change recently, as people have realized they're all in the same sinking boat. And so that Americans have been in despair. Case and Deaton have these very good studies called Death and Despair, because America is the only one of the rich countries where the age of death is going down. People die younger. Black people die much younger than white people. And men actually die younger than women. I think it's because they're not allowed to express emotion within the male stereotype, so they have a lot more stress. But that the country's going down. And it also meant a lot in personal life, because white men got a family wage. And with that family wage, they could buy a dependent wife who cooked, who cleaned, who provided sex, who reared children, and emotionally connected them to other people and socially connected them. She was the one who invited the relatives or the friends over. She was the person to whom it wasn't unmanly to confide. She was the one who took care of men. And what happened was that as women went into the workforce, they came home and rebelled against what Arlie Hochschild very cleverly called the second shift, to come home to do all the domestic labor, the childcare, the laundry, the cooking, the emotional care, and the social care. It was a bit much. And so women started saying, well, look, we're sharing the wage earning. How about sharing the housework? Well, still, the average unemployed man does less housework than his fully employed wife, and fully employed women with husbands who earn less than them do more of the share of household work to appease their husbands' egos, because doing housework is somehow debased because it was women's work. And so you have a rebellion of women against that arrangement and an abandonment of men, which puts men in a terrible situation. You probably noticed that every one of the mass killers are men, all men. It's one area I'm glad not to be equal, but I used to have a bumper sticker on my car, women who want equality with men lack ambition. I still feel that way, especially ambition and emotional expression. But what it meant is women could still emotionally connect with other women because they were used to it. Women look to other women friends, relatives for their emotional outlet and processing, whereas men look to women. And they still have their children, because women are overwhelmingly responsible for children. And they still have their own social networks, and women are doing better at work. Not that we're doing great, women still get 80 to 82% of what men get as a wage. But in the 60s, we got 59 cents on the male dollar and were thought of as being inappropriate for working outside the home. So that, and neglectful mothers. So that women, it was women's time. Women felt we had a movement behind us and we felt emboldened. And also as a fault with the women's movement, we didn't say there's a problem with gender, partly with a big boost from the CIA and Gloria Steinem, who was part of a big effort, the Great Wurlitzer Operation, to invade the women's liberation movement and make it gender only, excise class, and make the corporations happy. And it was the civil rights movement, make it the Black Power movement, hate whitey, instead of unite and make political change here. So, that was a mistake of ours. And men were alienated and didn't know how to connect.
Did you see that disconnect happening in the feminist movement
Yes.
at that time? Yes.
Yes, so many women were leaving their husbands instead of trying to bring their husbands with them. And there was an environment, particularly after the mid-70s when Gloria Steinem became prominent, of that it was men's fault and take your anger out at men, rather than looking at the fault of gender, which oppresses both sexes and necessitates our getting together and trying to talk and understand one another rather than just dismissing them. It made me leave the women's liberation movement, which I started as in New Haven. I read the notes from the first year, which was a periodical by the first women's liberation people in 1968. And I thought, oh, wow, we have to do this here. And I was in the committees to end the war in Vietnam. I asked if we could use their office and meet. I sent out a notice to my friends. 5 people came up, and within 2 months, 100 people were there.
Wow.
Because it was the time. We were needed in the marketplace, so the capitalists were happy to get us out of the home or give us permission and have us turn against men, which was a big mistake. But it was too anti-male for me. At that time, I started a movement for midwifery rights in the hospital because we didn't have them. And they had doctors and interns and residents messing up with your vagina while you were pregnant and examining you and being very insensitive. And we preferred midwives. And so we organized citizens concerned about childbirth and got the right of midwives to practice at the hospital. And I went to the Women's Liberation Office, which we had started so long ago. And I said, will you join us? Because a right to have a birth the way you choose it is a woman's right, and to not be a passive recipient of unwanted medical attention. But they really weren't interested. And on the wall was a big poster that said it all. It was kind of funny, but it said it all. That a picture of the first man on the moon, first man in space. And they said they sent one into space, now they can take the rest of them. Which was kind of funny, but it's not the politics you want for a unified movement for change. To split people according to gender or race for that matter. And so I switched out and did more of other things, that anti-war. And at the school where I taught, we started the civil rights movement, rebelling against the principal, the white, old principal who gave the terribly inferior education the children were getting. A parent came to me all angry and she said, you don't have any toilet paper in the school. She was ready for me to give her lip. I said, are you kidding? We don't have hardly anything. Here's my number. Call me at home. And me and 6 other teachers got from the registrar a list of all the parents, and we went door to door letting them know their kids weren't getting a proper education and that there was a racist push against them. And we had to march downtown, and I was much more involved in those things then. I've always been involved in something because I do believe you can make the world better and you should try. Mm-hmm. So anyway, that's a little bit of history.
Yeah, and it's I think very telling that there is a response there that is one that very quickly, as you say, it sort of snowballed, that suddenly you communicate with somebody in a different way, and suddenly there are a whole bunch of people there, and suddenly you're marching downtown.
That's right. Because nobody had come to them as a teacher and said, your kid is really getting cheated. Right. She's not getting an education, or he's not getting an education. You need to do something about it. You need to come and join the Hill Parents Association and make a change. And I remember feeling quite triumphant. By that time, I was a cluster teacher. I went around and helped teachers improve. And I also took out kids who were really not doing well and helped them. And I came into Miss Bergen, horrible racist person who wouldn't let the kids even use good paper. It was too good for them. I came into her class and she was saying to the kids, which of you children's parents are picketing outside? And the kids proudly raised their hands. And she said, well, they'll go to jail and you'll go to jail. And this little girl, Pam Epps, stood up and put her hand on her hip and said, don't you roll your eyes at me, old lady. I'll bring in my mama. She'll beat your butt. And the kids all clapped and laughed because it was it was an empowerment. And she was a terrible teacher. She used to talk to the Puerto Rican kids by saying, put the coat in the closet, and think she was communicating. Oh, it was bizarre. It was just bizarre. And parents responded. It was a time when people wanted to hope and get organized. I remember I put up a notice at Elm Haven, and 99%, if not 99.9% Black project, saying there was a meeting about opportunities for them and their children that had to change. And 50 people came, even though I'm a little white lady. It worked because people were ready for change. There are times when people are ready, and I feel they're getting ready now. With Black Lives Matter, Me Too, Time's Up, the climate movement. What we don't have is a central class umbrella, like the post of an umbrella with the spokes out of climate, race, gender, sex, united with class transformation, so that we'd have a unified movement and therefore much more power. Hopefully that'll come.
Yeah. I wondered if you could comment on some of the statistics and some of the trends. You started to touch into it. You started to touch on it already. This remarkable declining life expectancy in the richest country that's ever existed. If we count the wealth of the top 1%, it is the wealthiest country that ever existed, which is something that began before COVID, just to be clear.
Yes.
There is no famine, there was no domestic war. This was declining internally.
It was. And, as Case and Deaton very, very wonderfully document in their book, Deaths of Despair, this has happened, particularly in Middle America and the South, where white women are dying even faster than Black women die, quite unusually, because what they hoped for and counted on when they were younger was to be married to somebody who had a family wage and be able to bring up their kids in a reasonable way and do the housework and the other things expected of a woman in a leisurely way that gave them some prestige as Mrs. So-and-so, whose husband works at this factory, or whose husband works in the family grocery store, or whatever. And those dreams are dashed. And the majority of women are now single by choice because they're not signing up for the second shift at home. A lot of men don't understand what's happening, and women don't know how to bring their husbands along, and they wouldn't come anyway in many cases because they want women to compensate them for their lost manhood with the lost wages that corporations are offering. And they've been pushed a narrative that the problem is uppity women and Black people and refugees taking their jobs, when that's not true. You know, I had a client of mine who had a radio show, and he said it really well. A caller called in and said, my pet peeve is these refugees, they're taking our jobs. And my client, who was sort of funny, said on his program, yeah, I want to sell air fresheners by the highway. Yeah, you know. But that's the narrative of Trump and the right wing, to suck up and kick down. And the left narrative is to expose that that isn't so. You're just kicking down the people who are beneath you. And that's a fascistic program, the Bush program. And so that there's been a huge bifurcation in the United States. And now, look, the majority of women are single. Many of the up and coming working class leaders are women, and progressives are women. The two most militant and progressive unions in the United States are the flight attendants with Sarah Nelson, and also the Nurses United. Those are female unions, and women are feeling more empowered. And so 70% of the divorces of college-age women are initiated by women. It used to be that men initiated the majority of divorces. Working class women have a lesser majority, but nonetheless a majority of initiating divorces because they don't want to sign up for a second shift and being treated unequally. And yet they don't have the security, the future, the comfort. There used to be these two jokes that represented the awful things about those marriages. People got emotionally divorced because being divorced was kind of a shame on the family. And they got emotionally divorced, but they stayed together and were stable. And there was a joke for women saying, there's a handy little thing called a wife. You screw it on the bed. It does all the housework and childcare, right? And the women's joke were, men are like linoleum. You lay them right once, you can walk on them for 20 years, right? So they weren't exactly always blissful unions, but there was a sense of being settled, knowing what was happening, having continuity. For men, there was a job that was stable, not precarious as it is now, and that afforded them prestige in their community. And there were many small businesses where men and women worked together. The family grocery store, which is now Walmart. The family hardware store, which is now Home Depot and Walmart. The family gas station, which is now Exxon owned or Mobil, etc. And so that the little luncheonettes, which are now McDonald's, so that the kind of pride of people who had a little something who had a family business and had the little bit of prestige that comes with, let's say, your shoe store, which is now also Walmart or some other enormity, that they're now in low-wage work in the same field perhaps, but as a low-wage worker without stability, without pension, without durability, and without prestige or extra money. Because up until the 1970s, if you were white and in a family headed by a male, every generation could do a little better than the last from 1820 to the 1970s. If you were a menial worker, you could be a more skilled machinist. If you were, or a secretary, if you were a woman, a little bit better than let's say a domestic worker or a cash register worker, you had a skill. If you were white collar, blue collar, your kids could be white collar. If you were white collar, your kid could be a professional. And so every generation did better than the last if you were white and in a family headed by males. Now the family problems that used to be ascribed to Black pathology and were in 1965 by Patrick Moynihan, that Black men are immoral and lazy and that's why they have problems. No, they couldn't earn a family wage. And now Charles Murray, in his book Falling Apart, says now white working class men are immoral and lazy and that's why the family's falling apart. No, it was built on a family wage. And we don't have the infrastructure that most European countries do. Well, they all have public health insurance and public childcare. France, which is as racially diverse as the US, has universal childcare starting at 2 years old and free education through college. And so they don't have those expenses. And in the daycares and nursery schools and schools, they have medical care, they have psychiatric care. If the child seems to be having a problem, they refer them to someone so that there's a level of protection. And they're living longer, not shorter. And ironically, the United States, people used to grow taller with every generation. That stopped too, because there's something about hope as well as decent nutrition that isn't achieved by eating junk food in a hopeless time. And so that America is basically now a declining empire. As you watch people hightail it out of one of the poorest countries in the world, you could certainly understand that. And if you lived during the evacuation of Vietnam, you could see a repeat defeat of the most expensive military machine that spends more on military might than the next 10 most militarized countries. Well, so you see, wait a minute, this doesn't work. And even when the United States does things like anti-Chinese propaganda, they said China is having an upsurge of COVID. Well, they did. They had 161 new cases. We have over 1,000 a day. They have built, when it happened in Wuhan, they built 11 hospitals. They closed the place off. They have closed off the cities where there were increases and made people stay home. And because they are authoritarian, if you didn't stay home, they'd weld your house shut and give you food through the window. No option. But, New Zealand also tackled the problem, and they're not an authoritarian country under Jacinda Ardern, but people felt we're in it together. They didn't have people demonstrating for the right to not use masks or protective equipment, because they trusted their government. And so now I see that people's personal lives and our country are falling apart. They're getting the basic unit of stability was the family. The biggest increase of types of family in the United States are married people who don't want children. It's too expensive, and they might not even have a planet, no less a job, you know?
Yes,
So a lot
of people who are very concerned about the prospects of bringing children into the world at this time, when
right.
It's quite shocking to see how little has been done on the environmental issue. We've known about this for so long.
We have. And so the kids that you raise may not even have a planet. And they certainly won't have free childcare, free healthcare, free after school care, free summer care. None of the things that other countries afford. Portugal, which is a poor European country, is doing so much better. They have free daycare. They have free medical care. If you are an addict in Portugal, they sell drugs to you, healthy drugs. You don't get heroin mixed with cement or something. And in the drug wagon that comes around where you can buy your drugs, if you want counseling to stop, they'll give it to you and they'll help you. And it's paid for by the people who buy drugs. Now, they are a unity government, which we don't hear about much in the United States because they're a united government of Greens, socialists, and communists. And they've gotten along much better. All of the nations of Europe have strong socialist preferences. We're the only one with two capitalist parties. And people are starting to think, wait a minute, something's wrong here. Because, you know, they're not prospering. People are even leaving the evangelical movement. You know, why didn't Jesus give us the pork chops this time? Uh-oh, get out of here. You know, God isn't delivering because our country has wealth, but it's not going to the mass of the American people. And that's causing all sorts of problems that are revealed in the failure of our for-profit health system and our for-profit capitalist system. So that our personal lives are precarious, are difficult, are romantically alienated, are unstable. You know, I have a client who has a good job in New York, but she, with her money that she gets, and she's single, she rents her pictures in her house. Until COVID stopped it, she rented her clothes. She rented her furniture because she thought, when I have to leave this job, everything's going in my car to my next job.
Right.
Americans didn't have to live like this.
Yes.
It wasn't a nation of precarity.
Yes. I at one point, I had moved 9 times in 8 years.
Wow.
And, I know many others who have had similar circumstances. Very common to only keep around what one can quickly put back into a box, into one's late 20s, early 30s.
That's right.
And I think that when we hear about the ability of, even when I think of my grandfather, who never went to college and was able on a 40-hour work week to have a house and a family and a car in the garage and a pension upon retirement. It sounds like a science fiction novel. It's right. It's starting to sound like that couldn't have really happened. That couldn't have been possible.
And yet it did.
Right.
It did for 150 years. And I think Americans at first were in stunned disbelief. I think Black people weren't, because they'd always had many fewer opportunities. Right. And now they're waking up to this terrible reality and wanting to do something about it, at least, and unionizing for the first time in about 50 years, lots of union drives and solidarity, and going to the People's Party or the Democratic Socialists and joining the climate movement or the Black Lives Matter or Time's Up or Me Too or any of the others. Because people are understanding that, wait a minute, this ideology of democracy and fairness and so on does not apply to us. And we are the majority.
We should be more empowered than we are.
Yes, we should be.
Yeah.
We should be more empowered, and it's not going to happen unless we make it happen. And movements like the Black Lives Matter movement has made us aware. Watching that lynching on video of George Floyd with the knee on his neck kind of woke a lot of Americans up. And it was a 17-year-old girl who took the film and unloaded it onto the internet, because people watched and filmed and talked. And the Me Too movement has just gotten our very sexist and very capitalist mayor to resign.
Yes, Cuomo, yes.
Yeah.
Can we, that's actually a great segue into another question that I wanted to throw your way. And I suppose here we're going into some of the building blocks of society as well. We've been doing a lot of grand overview. But when I was introduced to capitalism, like most people, I think, although I think some people are perhaps understanding a little better, we were sort of just taught that it was trying to sell the best shampoo on the market, and didn't really understand what a capitalist structure was or a corporate structure was, and how that enables the not just monsters, but serial monsters in the case of Harvey Weinstein, Roger Ailes, people who were able to do this for a very long period of time. Can you perhaps speak to why we need to bring capitalism into this conversation, why it's so important in an understanding of this Me Too moment that we are in?
Well, I think what has happened with Weinstein, R. Kelly, Cosby, Cuomo, Epstein, is that patriarchy, the idea that men are superior and women are lesser beings who should serve men, and capitalism get together and shape one another. So in the Weinstein case, you have these aspiring actresses who want to meet with Weinstein because he's the biggest producer around. And they go to meet at his hotel room where he has a woman come in, one to give him his shot of Viagra before the meeting. And then she plans to leave. She knows she's setting up another woman for rape, but she needs the job. And he rapes the woman, or, comes on her shirt, or does all the other varieties he did. And the reason he gets away with it is because he's one of the biggest producers in Hollywood, because he's wildly successful, and because women's need for him, for their careers, for their economic and social opportunities and political opportunities, depend on him. And he uses his money that he dangles, and he uses to buy all the people that he needs to collude in his sex predation. And he also uses his money so that if the woman complains to the hotel that someone's beating on her door, which has been the case, they won't come up there. Or if she complains to other people on the set, they won't intervene. And other actors, they won't say anything because their careers and their money also depends on Weinstein. And then you have Epstein, who's a serial predator, who is allowed to exist for several reasons. One is because he gives the tapes of the rapes by these prominent men to the CIA, who pay him very well. And also he enables billionaires to basically rape children, underage girls, as well as he enabled two of our presidents, President Clinton and President Trump, who flew on the Lolita Express to Sex Slave Island, where they get to rape underage girls. And the reason he gets away with it is A, the CIA connection, and B, he's enormously wealthy. And these girls are often homeless. Ghislaine Maxwell, his madam, went to either high school girls who looked like they didn't have any money, or homeless girls, or foster girls. offered them a job as a massage therapist that paid well, got them to come and be raped in a huge, beautiful mansion with all sorts of people colluding, from the door service to all the maid service and so on. And they felt so small and so sexually humiliated that they didn't do anything. And then after 35 women had the courage to push for something, for doing something, and Julie Brown exposed it in the Miami Chronicle, I think, or the Miami Herald. Then Epstein was arrested and he got away for 35 sexual assaults. He got punished with 2 years of incarceration in the evenings with 6 days a week off to go to work, and 1 day in jail for 2 years. And when Acosta, who parenthetically later became appointed labor secretary by Trump, when Acosta was asked, wait a minute, 35 girls are assaulted and he gets 2 years with 6 days to do what he wants, he said, it's above my pay grade, which indeed it was. It was the CIA. And then when it really got out of hand, and Julie Brown exposed this to everyone, this deal that was made, then Epstein was arrested and he was put in a federal penitentiary.
And it takes that much. It takes that much to get that going.
It takes that. Epstein's first partner in sex crimes was none the less but our ex-district attorney's father. What was his name again? The ex-district Barr. Senior Barr was known as Chester Molester at Dalton School. And Senior Barr gave Jeffrey Epstein his first opportunity teaching high school people physics and math when he didn't even have a college degree. And when things started coming out, both Epstein and Barr quit. And Epstein went into business for himself, and Barr got a job at another fancy prep school. So that there's all sorts of intrigue going on here. And then when Julie Brown of the Miami Herald exposed this, Epstein became a CIA impediment, meaning we couldn't handle that. They broke into his mansion, which a very rich man gave him. We don't know why. They broke in, they exploded the safe that had the tapes of all these men's predation on young girls. He was arrested and he commits suicide. He commits suicide highly suspiciously. He had made a suicide attempt weeks before. The rule at the prison is if any inmate commits suicide, they need to have a cellmate for months. His cellmate disappeared, got moved out of his cell. The light in front of his cell was broken. The 2 orderlies who were supposed to monitor him every half hour fell asleep. They were both on overtime, 24-hour shifts, and one wasn't even supposed to be on the job. She was a substitute. And for 1 day in the New York Times, there was a report of his cellmates saying they heard screams from his cell around the time that he committed suicide. Then that disappeared from the newspapers. People don't usually announce it when they commit suicide and scream, but it's a suicide. And so there's intrigue and capitalist predation and permission to rape and permission to organize rape based on the money, CIA connection, and desperate little girls wanting a career, or desperate grown-up women, as in the case with Bill Cosby's 80 women who reported it. And silence on the part of all those people who received the report. Even the guard who testified, who was about 90 and retired, he testified at Cosby's trial, and he said, they came out in all disarray. Cosby told me not to disturb him. He was interviewing talent, and I knew something was wrong, but I needed the job.
Right.
And that's it. That's capitalism and patriarchy with sex abuse, because these aren't really people after all. They're females combining. And of course, it's the same with Cuomo coming on to his employees who needed the job, who wanted a future in politics. It's true across the board. Herman Cain, who was for a while being courted by the Republican Party, Black man, gave women who worked for him as his hotels the choice to have sex with him or not get the job. You know, it's, and
That's
look, some women, some women supervisors do that too, to men who want to keep a job. But it's overwhelmingly males who feel entitled on the basis of superiority as males, and that these aren't really people, they're not really humans, they're sex objects, and they're capitalist power.
Right. Yeah, as I was preparing for this interview, I was reflecting. She's not a revolutionary, but she's very funny. Fran Lebowitz. Yes. I like a lot of her quotes, and so I watched the documentary series she did with Martin Scorsese, Pretend It's a City, and she has an episode where she talks about this, and she sort of says something along the lines of the reason the Epstein case and the Roger Ailes case kind of went gangbusters was that they had these people who went on to be celebrities who were victims of them. But of course, this happens on a massive scale in fields in which there are no celebrities. Absolutely. And that the most desperate, of course, or the most easily victimized are the most vulnerable people, like undocumented immigrants who Exactly. Have the additional threat of deportation over their heads.
And that additional power. 30,000 farm workers filed suits under Time's Up, which is Me Too for people who can't afford a lawyer.
Right.
You know,
right.
Because they have the power to either hire you or not. And then you go hungry.
Right. Yeah.
Capitalism at work.
We haven't discussed very many optimistic topics, but I would like to sort of throw one that's again in your wheelhouse. Something that I was thinking about as I prepared for this interview was how the largest worker cooperative in the United States is Cooperative Home Care Associates, which started with about a dozen employees, and I think now is in the thousands of employees, and 90% of them are comprised of women. And I know from documentary footage I've seen of Cooperative Home Care Associates, that they do have, or have had at least, male executives. And I thought about how different that connotation is when you hear that there's a male executive in a capitalist corporation and 90% of the workforce is women. You immediately get uneasy feelings about it. Whereas if that's somebody who is elected by the workforce and is accountable to that workforce, it has a completely different connotation. You know that person's behavior is impeccable.
That's right.
So would you like to perhaps talk a little bit about some of the alternatives that you and Democracy at Work have been so interested in?
Well, one of them, the biggest co-op in the world, is all women. It's the Usha Sex Workers Cooperative in Calcutta, of all places, not a progressive place usually, but they make their own sanitary napkins, they make their own birth control products, they have their own bank, because the banker that used to go to the prostitute at night then wouldn't give her a loan the next day. And so that they can empower their own people. And that co-ops are increasing. That's a very positive note, but there are many others. The fact that Black Lives Matter is on the agenda is recent. Everyone watched a lynching on their internet. Right. George Floyd was killed, 9 minutes on his neck. And people are taping and filming and reaching each other. And also, the labor movement is starting to organize. I mean, they lost in Bessemer, Alabama, and they didn't educate their public. They didn't go into the community earlier and try to educate people about unions, which was a big mistake. And they didn't have what they had in the 30s, which they had marches of the unemployed, hundreds of people walking down big avenues for jobs, organized by the Communist Party and the two socialist parties and the labor movement. And so, and they didn't, you know, people want fairness, but they don't have enough of an organized protest. I mean, FDR ran on a balanced budget, but he was smart and he could go to his rich friends and say to them, if you don't let me tax you at 96.8%, they're going to take your wealth. That's what's going to happen. And enough of them okayed it. But then at the end, they looked at the triumvirate that created a movement that gave us Social Security and unemployment insurance and vacation days and so many other 8-hour days. And they thought, let's take that back. And they've been working on it and investing it ever since. And someone like Reagan was very powerful. Look, FDR was big government. That was people's salvation. If Biden hired a similar number of Americans now that FDR hired when he was president, there would be 22 million workers not paid through the corporations, which Biden wants to do, so the corporations get a big cut, but paid directly by the federal government and paid decent wages to build dams and bridges, to paint and decorate, to save people's homes. They had a powerful socialist and communist and labor movements. And so they attacked those, and people are now beginning to fight back, which is really, really important. And in 2011, class was reintroduced to the American public through the Occupy movement, the 1% and the 99%. And although Obama had it eliminated on the same day, that figure and that consciousness is enough embedded in Americans so that as they see us losing a war where we spent over $1 trillion, without health care, with the most deaths in the world relative to our population, and a recession where they're losing their jobs, and even the 2008 recession where Obama saved the banks, but not all those mortgage holders who were cheated. They're catching on. And this is a moment of real hope and possibility in America. And that's important. So I am optimistic. And I'm doing 2 podcasts, and they have a following because people want to hear about our history and our reality that CBS and NBC don't bother mentioning. There's a guy who just wrote a book about the failure of Marxism in America. And he talks about how people touted Franklin Marxism, but now they see through it. Well, there was no such thing. He meant the Frankfurt School. And he said that it started in Berlin. Of course, it started in Frankfurt, the Frankfurt School. Hello. But our country has been kept so ignorant about these things that this guy gets away with having a bestseller. And yet that's changing. People are starting to learn. And that's very heartening. It's very hopeful. So I can honestly end on a hopeful note.
That's marvelous. But it's a great place to wrap it up. Dr. Harriet Fraad, this has been such a wide-ranging, informative, and ultimately, even though we went to some dark places, ultimately an inspiring conversation.
Good.
Thank you so much for this.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. You asked such great questions.